Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Diversity and Inclusion webinar, Leadership in an Era of Social Turbulence. Thank you for joining us today for this incredibly important topic. You are in for a treat. Dr. Johnson, who is joining us today as our presenter, presented to the NAA board last winter, and it was a really outstanding session. So we're looking forward to today's. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping points. This presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the Diversity and Inclusion Resources page of the NAA website early next week. So you will be able to watch it again or share it with your friends and colleagues. During the discussion, you may type questions into the Q&A or chat boxes on your screen, and we will share them with our presenter. We have left time at the end of the session for Q&A, so we welcome those questions throughout the session. Finally, today's webinar is being brought to you by Yardi. Esther Bernardi from Yardi has sent a video message to greet everybody today.
Hi, I'm Esther Bernardi with Yardi, and I am so glad that you have joined today's session in the Diversity and Inclusion series. My hat goes off to NAA for making this series available. And when we at Yardi learned about it, we wanted to jump right in and sponsor. Issues of diversity, equality, and inclusion are so important to us at Yardi, and your presence here today indicates that they are important to you too. If you joined us last week, you heard me say that the pandemic, as bad as it has been, has allowed us some time for clarity, some time to pay attention to things that have been long overlooked. And the best among us will learn and grow, and we'll make changes. This is critical for a healthy nation and a healthy industry. Thank you for being here today. I encourage you to take what you hear today and make a difference in the world around you. And with that, I'll turn it back over so that we can get started. Hi, I'm Esther Bernardi with Yardi.
Thank you to Esther and to Yardi for their sponsorship of today's session. Now I'm going to turn things over to Marcy French, so Marcy can introduce our speaker.
Of course, thanks, Amy. I'm super excited to introduce you today to James H. Johnson, Jr. He is the William R. Keenan Jr. Distinguished Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship in the Keenan-Flagler Business School and Director of the Urban Investment Strategy Center in the Frank Hawkins Keenan Institute of Private Enterprise at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His research interests, just to name a few, include community and economic development, the effects of demographic changes in the U.S. workplace, and inter-ethnic minority conflict in advanced industrial societies. He has co-authored The Economic Impact of the African American Population on the State of North Carolina. In addition, Dr. Johnson has published more than 100 scholarly research articles, and currently he is researching strategies to combat hypersegregation, persistent and concentrated poverty, and gentrification-induced residential and economic dislocations in U.S. cities. Fast Company profiled him in Hopes and Dreams, and he has received his Ph.D. from Michigan State University, his master's from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and his bachelor's from North Carolina Central University. All of this and more make him more than an expert on the field of diversity and inclusion. On behalf of the National Apartment Association and the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, it's my honor to introduce you to Dr. James Johnson. Dr. Johnson.
Thank you very much, Ms. French, for that kind introduction. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am extremely pleased to have the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you today on leading, managing, and communicating in an era of social turbulence. If I could have the next slide. I will begin by talking about what I perceive to be the new normal that we all have to operate in, and then I will move to a discussion of what you need as leaders and managers in your communities to manage what I would call certain uncertainty. And then we will talk a little bit about navigating turbulence moving forward, and I will conclude with a few takeaways. Next slide. The COVID-19 pandemic and the nation's nationwide civil unrest spawned by the recent spate of senseless killings of unarmed African Americans have illuminated what executive development professionals have been telling private and public sector leaders for quite some time. We are living in an era of increasing volatility, increasing uncertainty, increasing complexity, and ambiguity, what we call a VUCA world. That VUCA world, I say, it translates into certain uncertainty being the new norm in society. These two extremely traumatic events, the pandemic and the civil unrest tied to senseless killings, are the latest in a host of disruptive forces that have dramatically transformed our environment, our economy, and personal well-being. The tragic events of 9/11, the Great Recession of 2008-2010, Hurricane Katrina, and the Gulf Coast oil disaster are noteworthy past examples. Next slide, please. And today, we are dealing with another round. We're still dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. We're dealing with the politics of masks. We're dealing with the politics of science and the like. We're dealing with systemic racism motivated by the Black Lives Protest movement. And we're in the midst of the Atlantic hurricane season and the threat of other adverse weather events. Meteorologists have told us, and it is coming to life, that this is the most active hurricane season in 4 decades. And as we speak, Hurricane Sally is still wreaking havoc. And then there are the wildfires on the West Coast. Conspiracy theories, social media and fake news, deep fakes and social media identity theft, artificial intelligence and sexist, racist, and homophobic data, the defund the police movement, an upcoming 2020 election, Biden versus Trump, potential interference, voter suppression, and the politics of everything. Next slide, please. And then there are us. It is nearly impossible to go through one day without hearing alarming information on the news about national security concerns, terrorism, or disaster. The population is on alert, feeling unsafe, overwhelmed, and helpless when facing ongoing unpredictability. The end product is, if we can have the next slide, is certain uncertainty is the new normal. It is the equivalent of standing in the midst of a storm and a torrential rain without an umbrella, and then there's you asked to do more with less. Certain uncertainty is the new normal. Next slide. And so the question is how do we navigate this uncertainty? What do we need in our toolkits to thrive, prosper, and remain resilient as individuals and as communities moving forward? My toolkit appears in the next slide. I want to list these these 6 things, and then we'll talk about each one of them quickly. I think to weather certain uncertainty, you need serious analytical reasoning skills. You need an entrepreneurial mindset, contextual intelligence, cultural elasticity, knowledge networks, effective listening and communications, and agility and flexibility. Let's talk about each one of these things in turn, beginning with the next slide. What are we talking about when we talk about analytical reasoning? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not talking about revisiting or returning to your stat class that you took in college or in graduate school. Analytical reasoning is about the ability to leverage big data analytics and GIS mapping and strategy development, especially in all phases of crisis management. It is, however, imperative that there are no inherent racial, ethnic, or gender biases in the analytical tools used to derive strategy. Leveraging big data and GIS mapping is the best way to unpack complexity in a society where the new normal is certain uncertainty. It will enable you to understand the nature of disparities in communities you serve. It is the best way for you as a leader to overcome any unconscious bias you might have, because your ability to look at complex relationships and unravel that complexity will help you and aid you in becoming a sage leader in understanding how complex our society is and the connections between various and sundry parts of our economy and a larger political system. On top of analytical reasoning skills, the second, if we can have the next slide, tool that you will need is an entrepreneurial mindset. This is the demonstrated ability and willingness to deal with ambiguity, to take incalculable risk, and to manifest tenacity and decisiveness in responding sensitively, nimbly, and quickly to unanticipated crises and opportunities that arise. Let me be clear. Entrepreneurial mindset is not about starting a business. Rather, it's about unlearning old ways of thinking and doing. In times of crisis, people look to leaders who are decisive and transparent with regard to the intelligence or information that shape their actions. For the entrepreneurial leader, the proverbial glass is always half full, even when it's half empty. Entrepreneurial leaders do not shy away from uncertainty. They groove on ambiguity. The next slide. You will also need contextual intelligence to weather certain uncertainty. What is contextual intelligence? It is an acute sensitivity to the social, political, technological, economic, and demographic drivers of change that will likely define the future. Effective leaders master context. Ineffective leaders surrender to context. Leaders face two types of change in today's world: predictable change and unpredictable change. Predictable changes are the things that we know are going to happen. We know, for an example, that the kid who was 6 years old last school year will be 7 years old this school year. If you get blindsided by predictable change, you're just not very smart. Contextual intelligence is about having the foresight to anticipate unpredictable or unanticipated change. It is the ability to peer through the fog of certain uncertainty and identify both the landmines to be avoided and the propitious opportunities worthy of pursuit. Leaders who master contextual intelligence are able to see around the corner well before they approach it. To use a hockey analogy, they skate not to where the puck is, but instead to where the puck is headed. Successful leaders use every information tool available to stay on top of their information game. I, for one, am old school. I'm a Google alert and smart news junkie because I get diverse perspectives and the latest information as frequently as I choose to select it from those various sites. The next thing you need in your toolkit: cultural elasticity, the ability to change behavioral norms to align with ever-changing situational contexts and environmental milieus in an increasingly diverse and VUCA world. This is also known as the ability to code switch. Leaders with code switching acumen are able to interface successfully with diversity in terms of not only race and ethnicity, gender, and international origin, they are also able to deal effectively with diversity of thought. They possess impeccable soft skills. Popularly stated, they are able to move from the streets to the suites without missing a beat. Next, knowledge networks. What are knowledge networks? These are diverse ties and connections that span the political and ideological spectrum, and they are the key to effective leadership in an era of certain uncertainty. Effective leaders welcome unwelcome ideas. In a world dominated by confirmation bias, where individuals typically only listen to and read information sources that are consistent with their beliefs, effective leadership requires knowledge and understanding of diverse viewpoints on the issues of import in the current era of turbulence and uncertainty. As my grandmother used to say, there are two sides to every story, and the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. I just heard someone say this morning there are actually three sides to every story. There's what people believe on two sides, and then there's what I believe as the third perspective. But in the interest of the best interest of our society and community, we need to be able to manage information from diverse perspectives, to secure and acquire information from diverse perspectives if we're going to be able to manage turbulence and uncertainty. My next tool, next slide, is effective listening and communications. Weathering certain uncertainty requires a growth mindset. That means you must move beyond your expertise acquired through your formal education and training to enthusiastically embrace new learning. with a keen willingness to engage in courageous listening, not to refute, but to understand and appreciate alternative viewpoints and perspectives. Effective learning and communications prepares leaders to deal with the courageous confrontations and the courageous conversations we are having and must continue to have if we're going to solve America's systemic racism problem. Far too many people today are unwilling to engage in courageous listening. They are listening to refute, but not to appreciate and understand. And we need more appreciation. We need more understanding in our society today. My last tool is agility and flexibility. The ability to respond unhesitatingly to unanticipated crises by reinventing the way business is done in the private sector and services are delivered in the public sector. Effective leaders are able to cut on a dime and give 9 cents change. They do not experience psychic numbing when faced with adversity. So the keys to leading and managing in an era of certain uncertainty, the next slide. You must recognize that change is the only constant that you will face moving forward. And you must recognize that the change is going to be coming at you at breakneck speed, and there will be overlapping challenges, much like we are facing today. That is, to my way of thinking, the new normal. I think we all have to embrace lifelong learning, that growth mindset. If you're unwilling and open to learn, and especially to listen courageously, then I think the whole challenge of overcoming systemic racism, of overcoming many of the challenges that we face in society today will be much more difficult unless we embrace this notion of lifelong learning. And I think in a society torn apart by a pandemic, a massive economic downturn, and a whole series of other crises that we are experiencing today, we must demonstrate and practice empathy and compassion. There are lots of people in our society today, ladies and gentlemen, through no fault of their own, are suffering. Some people are losing their lives and the like at our local level, in our communities, in a diverse society that we are experiencing today. The notion of empathy and the notion of compassion will go a long way in helping us create resilient communities. And finally, I think it's imperative for us to champion the iceberg model of diversity. You know, with an iceberg, you only see about 30% of it, the visible parts of the iceberg. That means there's 70% that you don't see. It's underwater. The visible parts of diversity are the things that you can see: race and skin color, gender, whether someone has a visible disability. You can do something, predict people's, figure out their age group, whether or not their physical attributes, know something about ethnicity. If that's all you know, if you can click again, Ms. Allen, if that's all you know about me, you're not even a third of the way of being able to embrace diversity in its full flavor in our society. Managing diversity effectively is not just about what you see. It's about all of the things that you don't see. If we can have the next click on this slide. It's all of these things, those invisible diversity traits. Ladies and gentlemen, when we began to look beneath the visible and to begin to understand and appreciate the indivisible things, that is where communalities exist. It's all of these things in the lower part of the slide that really, really matter. I hope all of you can tell that I'm a Black male. Those are my visible traits. But what you would not know or recognize, just based on looking at me, you would not recognize that I lost 10 family members in the last decade, including my 19-year-old daughter who was brutally murdered 18 months ago, 2 days before her 20th birthday. Everything about me, ladies and gentlemen, is tied up in that experience. And when we began to understand the parts of our lives and cultures and communities that we don't see, what you will find is there are far more commonalities than there are differences in our society. And that requires us to get beneath the visible and understand that the key to resiliency in our society and in our communities, we have to be able to package these issues in a far more inclusive and equitable way. And so this initiative that the National Apartment Association is doing on diversity, inclusion, and belonging, you can't understand belonging until you understand not just what you see, but all of the things that people may be dealing with or struggling with on a daily basis. I have taught a diversity class at the business school for about since 1997, where we get beneath these invisible diversity traits through the power of storytelling. And it's amazing at the end of every class, the connections that exist in the class that you would never know existed by just looking at visibly. Because oftentimes we use visible traits to stereotype. How many of you have seen a person walk in the room and you decide before the person says anything or even utters a word, you decide you don't like them? You just size them up. And that's usually on inadequate and misinformation. If we're going to exist in a society that is increasingly diverse, as our nation is, if we're going to thrive, prosper, and compete, and be able to deal effectively with the incredible kinds of disruptions we're facing, we're going to have to embrace this iceberg model of diversity. We can win at all of this, ladies and gentlemen. We can overcome the challenges, but we have to be able to embrace our differences and understand that at the end of the day, it is our differences that are the key to our competitiveness in the global marketplace moving forward. I'll stop there, Ms. Allen, and I'm happy to take questions from people.
Thank you. I'm just, if anybody has any questions that they want to type into the Q&A box. Here's a question. What are some specific actions we can take, how to encourage change within local industries that seem intent on ignoring all of the recent social turbulence? How can one effectively engage in conversations that lead to tangible action and change?
Very good question. Thank you for that question. I think we have to help people who are obstinate and seem to be slow on the uptake to understand that the challenges that we face are competitiveness issues. We can't just appeal to people on social or moral grounds. We have to be able to let people know and understand that if we don't get these issues right, we're going to lose our competitiveness in the global marketplace. And so I think making the case on competitiveness grounds is that it's going to impact your bottom line if you don't do this. We're not going to win the global war for talent, by being exclusionary. It's going to take inclusion, and so we have to be able to make eloquently that argument, and always be prepared. When people say that is too expensive, we can't afford it, you always have to have the comeback, what's the cost of not doing it? And you need to have that number well in your back pocket when you're talking to people, because it's easy to say, we can't do that, we can't afford it, we don't have the money. Well, what's the cost of not doing it? In most cases, the cost of not doing it far exceed the cost of doing it. And so I would just get my cheat sheet, my talking notes, put it in my back pocket, and always be ready and frame it as a competitiveness issue. Understand that communities compete just like firms. They compete for foreign direct investment, they compete for talent, they compete for jobs, all of that. So the way you manage the people business in your community is a key to our competitiveness in the global marketplace. That's the way I usually approach it. Thanks for the question. Appreciate it.
A couple different people have asked how to start the conversation, especially at an organization that hasn't addressed social issues currently. So how do you start those kinds of conversations?
I think the most powerful way to start the conversation is to invite people to share their stories. The power of storytelling is incredible because you get beneath the surface. You know, it's just every company that I'm working with now are embracing the power of storytelling. I mean, they're big on it because it shows the human side of people and organizations, and it tells you so much about people that you didn't know, and then you begin to understand, now I understand why that person is quiet, or I understand why that person left the room when we started talking about a particular issue and the like. So I think inviting the storytelling, and secondly, I think setting up these courageous conversations about the status of our society today, but inviting people to engage in courageous listening. Set the ground rules for courageous listening. If you can do that, that means I have to be willing to listen, not to refute you, but to understand and appreciate your perspective. I didn't say you necessarily have to embrace it, but you have to be respectful of my perspective. And along the way, I think my grandma's adage about two sides of every story and the truth being in between somewhere comes to the fore. So I would say those two things: inviting those courageous conversations and inviting discourse about the courageous confrontations we're seeing in our society today, and being open to the diverse perspectives. Because, you know, we're not always right in our perspective. We got to be willing to listen and to and appreciate things. It's not just other people. And so those would be the two approaches I would use.
Thank you. One more question at this point. How do we show compassion and empathy without setting a privileged tone?
Say a little more. I'm not sure what that question is.
So I think for people who want to start these conversations and want to express their compassion and empathy, how to make sure that they don't come at it from a privileged perspective, or that their tone is set in the right way to encourage that courageous storytelling.
Oh, okay, I got it. I think there's enough need in our society today to be able to demonstrate compassion. You know, the one thing that I think is true today, no matter how well off we are, we got a cousin somewhere that's struggling. And that's across race, ethnicity, gender, international origin, or whatever. So I think the nature of inequality in our society today, the depths of inequality, and if you want to start with the low-hanging fruit, just look at our public school system and the struggles that kids face with food insecurity and a whole range of things. Start with the low-hanging fruit and then stretch out to more risky kinds of topics and issues and challenges. But I'm a big fan. I just think that the nature of inequality and the needs in our society today are so great that it's not hard to embrace, to get people to be passionate and understanding that there are a lot of people that are struggling in our society, and again, it's a form of enlightened self-interest for us to help them, to get them back on their feet and moving forward.
Thank you. As an aside, we've had a few requests for the source of the VUCA slide at the beginning. I think people are interested in knowing if they could use that or where they could find that.
It'll cost them about $10 million for every capital word in VUCA. That's VUCA. That's 40 million. Yes, ma'am. Large bills. I will send that. Mm-hmm.
Oh, great. Thank you. We can share that.
Sure.
We'll be sending out an email. Everybody has been asking. We'll be sending an email with a link to the recording of this session to everybody who's registered, so we can share any of those materials as well with that.
Happy to provide all of that.
Okay. And another question, how do I address the media? I'm noticing that in marketing tactics, all types of diverse people aren't fairly represented.
With care, with caution, what I would say. That's, I think, I always say with organizations, you need a communication strategy, a careful communication strategy, and you need a point person that is the contact person for your organization in all matters. You cannot have 15 different people giving their perspectives because everybody's passionate and sometimes they send the wrong signals, they miscommunicate, they're absolutely wrong or whatever. So I would say communication strategy with that embraces multi-channels of communication, because we have 5 generations in the workplace today, and we need to be able to communicate effectively across those 5 generations. And so to me, I think consulting people who do this work really, really well, who know what they're doing in multicultural communications, I think would be worth investigating, or just doing a little internet-based research on those multicultural and multi-generational strategies for interfacing with the public would be what I would say.
Thank you. And any tips on how to handle those who refuse to listen courageously? They refuse to accept or listen to the other side to the point that they poison those around them.
What I would recommend, I can't say publicly. So I think you have to, you know, sometimes people like that flip the switch. You engage in courageous listening on their perspective. Because far too often we just dismiss people like that. I want to hear what you're thinking. You know, help me understand your viewpoint. And by posing that question in and of itself, they got to listen to your questions to be able to answer. So they're engaging, you're engaging them by that very approach and strategy. You don't have to agree with everything, but you have to get a firm understanding. And maybe along the way, you can point out where the misinformation may be there, or just outright erroneous information, or you might figure out this is a waste of my time, but you need to try. I think too often we are dismissive, just like people are dismissive of our perspectives. Our biggest enemy today is confirmation bias. We only read and listen to things we believe, and we ignore the things we don't believe or feel comfortable with. We have to be able to have that stretch to understand the competing perspectives. And that's important, because when you walk in the room to communicate with someone, you don't know the political orientation of the people you're talking to. Somebody could be to the left of Mother Teresa and the other one to the right of Attila the Hun, and then there's you standing there having to field questions. That's why contextual intelligence is so important. You need to understand the nature of the landscape, and don't just read what you believe. Read the stuff you don't believe. I know that's hard for some people, but my experience has been that's the key to making major advances in society.
Another question. Sometimes storytelling requires getting permission from the person whose story you want to hear. What is the best way to engage someone and encourage them to tell a story that may be painful for them to tell, but vitally important for others to hear?
Absolutely. My rule in the class where I teach with storytelling, there is an immediate message in my course outline is, if it's too painful for you to tell, then we need to be respectful of that. But what my experience has been, even when people who have painful experiences, they may not talk about the painful experience, but in talking about self as far as they're willing to go, you learn a lot. You learn a lot. And I've had experiences where people get into it and they hear other people sharing personal experiences that are painful, it opens them up and makes them willing to share as well, because there's a connection there. There's a connection. When I talk about my loss, there's a girl next to me and says, yeah, I lost my brother in a tragic car accident. Another kid from Saudi Arabia says, you know, I lost my grandfather in a plane crash. I mean, things like that. You begin to see these connections that you never would think are there. But you do have to be respectful of people who have painful experiences that they don't want to share.
Thank you. Here's another scenario. The company this person works for has implemented a diversity and minority team, but the leaders of the team are all white men and women. And they're the ones that she feels needs the training the most, but the reason they're on the leadership team is that they are the leaders of the company. So what can she do to affect any type of change in this situation?
Courageous conversations. Propose a set of courageous conversations so that they hear from their employees, and they get to listen and encourage them to engage in the courageous listening. You can do it by taking a topic of import to the company that has enormous implications for diversity and inclusion. Or you can suggest that they invite a speaker in that communicates some of the messages that you think they need to hear. And a lot of times there are, you know, workshops and exercises that people can go through that they learn a lot from the exercise in and of itself.
Thank you. This person is referring back to the toolkit that you talked about at the beginning. In the first toolkit item, what sort of analysis of data? Can you provide any further insight on the sort of analysis of data from that toolkit item?
Sure, very good question. So I'm a big GIS fan, and I wrote a paper several years ago on invisible fences. And what the paper was about was communities who deny African-American communities access to essential services like water and sewer. You would never know that driving around on the landscape who has water and sewer service until you use the power of GIS to map the water and sewer system and then superimpose on that a census tract map of the racial and ethnic composition of communities. What we were able to show is that the sewer system in one community capped off in one lady's front yard, and she had an old septic system that was leaking cryptosporidium in her water and the like, and the only thing that separated her from having access to water and sewer service was a street. But without the power of GIS, we would have never been able to document how almost like gerrymandering, you know, these surgical strategies that are used to exclude people from access to various services and the like. That's one concrete example. You know, now people are using cell phone data and the like to understand what's happening to people and to do contact tracing for coronavirus pandemic. I'm looking at cell phone data now to look at what I call coronavirus pandemics, people who are leaving major cities and ending up in North Carolina. And so there are a number of innovative tools that can be used to unravel complexity so that we don't have stereotypical prisms for people and communities that we work with on a daily basis. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Do you have any reading recommendations for this group? Books that you suggest for people who are?
I'll send a link to all of the stuff, and you all have to read it all overnight, and we're gonna have a test tomorrow morning.
You have to grade all the tests then.
I'm gonna have my big data mining people grade the test.
Thank you. We'll send out those recommendations along with the link as well.
Sure.
I think that wraps up our questions for right now.
Okay.
All right. So let's talk about what's next for diversity inclusion webinars. The next one up is on September 30th, and we'll be covering inclusive communities, improve resident living experiences. And in this webinar, you'll learn the impact of inclusive community commitments to the resident experience, the importance of examining community practices, marketing, customer service, and resident engagement with an inclusion-oriented lens, insights into training on inclusion and community involvement, and various direct examples of how inclusive community design creates positive resident experiences. Again, September 30th from 11 a.m. to noon Eastern time, and it is free from the NAA. All right. Another reminder, diversity inclusion opportunity. We have a deadline coming also on September 30th. NAA is currently accepting applications for the Innovation in D&I grant. The Innovation in Diversity and Inclusion, otherwise known as the IDI grant, is designed to encourage and support member-related organizations' innovative ideas that advance diversity and inclusion. Learn more about this opportunity and the application requirements by visiting naahq.org/diversity-inclusion. Right? And then finally, I just want to highlight 2 additional D&I resources available to all the NAA members. One is our best practices in diversity and inclusion, and the other is unconscious bias course in Visto. And you can find both of those opportunities by also visiting naahq.org/diversity-inclusion. Thank you again for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for a fantastic webinar today, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day.
Thank you.